War, a word usually associated with years of bloodshed, millions of deaths, and destroyed cities. World War I lasted more than 4 years. World War II lasted 6 years. Even small local conflicts can continue for months or years. But one war in human history lasted less than an ordinary school lesson. Imagine this. You start a timer, and before a school class even ends, one country has already declared war, lost it, and surrendered. This is not a joke, and not a legend. On August 27, 1896, the shortest war in human history took place. It lasted approximately 38 minutes. And the most terrifying part is that hundreds of people died during that time. It was a war between the British Empire and the small Sultanate of Zanzibar, near the coast of East Africa. At that time, the British Empire was a true monster of global politics. Its territories covered almost a quarter of the planet. British warships controlled the seas, and its army was considered one of the strongest in the world. Back then, there was even a famous phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," because British colonies were literally everywhere. Now imagine the tiny tropical island of Zanzibar, a small sultanate with narrow streets, wooden buildings, and outdated cannons. Compared to the British Empire, it was like an ant fighting a tank. But it was here that a war took place that would enter history forever. Everything began after the sudden death of Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini. He was the ruler of Zanzibar and maintained good relations with the British. The British Empire already had enormous influence over the island. In reality, Zanzibar depended heavily on London, and the British wanted a ruler they could control to take the throne next. But everything went wrong. Immediately after the Sultan's death, his relative Khalid bin Bargash seized power. He quickly occupied the palace and declared himself the new sultan. The problem was that he did this without British approval. For the British Empire, this looked like direct defiance. London had no intention of tolerating such a challenge. British diplomats and military officers immediately arrived in Zanzibar. They delivered an ultimatum to Khalid. Either he leaves the palace voluntarily, or war will begin. Khalid refused. Maybe he believed the British were bluffing. Maybe he hoped for support from local people. Or maybe he simply could not believe that the world's greatest empire would start a war over a tiny island. But he was wrong. After Khalid's refusal, the British fleet began gathering near Zanzibar's coast. And this is where the story becomes truly incredible. On one side, a wooden palace, a few old cannons, and around 2,800 soldiers, servants, and armed supporters. On the other side, modern British warships equipped with heavy artillery. The armored ships stood directly in the harbor. Their guns were aimed straight at the Sultan's palace. Zanzibar had almost no chance, but Khalid still refused to surrender. On August 27, 1896, the British gave their final warning. The ultimatum would expire exactly at 9 a.m. British officers waited for a response, but the Sultan's flag was still flying above the palace. That meant only one thing. The war was about to begin. At exactly 9:02 a.m., British warships opened fire. The first shells smashed directly into the palace. Wooden walls exploded into pieces. Fire, smoke, and panic spread everywhere. People jumped from windows. Soldiers desperately tried to fire back using outdated cannons. But it was hopeless. The British fleet was destroying Zanzibar's defenses within minutes. Shell after shell demolished buildings surrounding the palace. Soon, the Sultan's yacht, the Glasgow, caught fire. It was one of Zanzibar's few military vessels. The yacht attempted to fight the British fleet, but British artillery sank it almost immediately. Everything turned into chaos. The palace was burning. People were fleeing through the streets. Wounded soldiers lay beneath the rubble. And most importantly, Khalid began realizing that the war was already lost. The British advantage was overwhelming. Just over half an hour had passed since the bombardment began. And at 9:40 a.m., the Sultan's flag was lowered. That meant surrender. The war was over. 38 minutes. Less time than a single school lesson. According to different estimates, Zanzibar suffered hundreds of casualties killed or wounded. The British, meanwhile, suffered almost no losses. And this demonstrated the enormous imbalance between colonial empires and small dependent states at the end of the 19th century. Khalid bin Bargash escaped to the German consulate. Later, he managed to flee Zanzibar completely. Meanwhile, the British installed a new sultan fully loyal to their rule. This allowed the British Empire to strengthen its control over Zanzibar even further. But the story does not end there. What happened after the war was almost as shocking as the war itself. After the surrender, British soldiers quickly occupied key locations across Zanzibar. Government buildings, ports, and military positions all fell under British control within hours. The destroyed palace still burned, while wounded civilians searched for survivors among the ruins. Smoke covered the city. For many people in Zanzibar, it felt less like a war and more like a public execution. British officials immediately moved to restore order. A new sultan, Hamoud bin Mohammed, was placed on the throne under British supervision. But there was one important condition. He would rule only with British approval. From that moment, Zanzibar became even more dependent on the British Empire, and the effects of the war changed the island forever. One of the biggest changes came shortly afterward. Under pressure from Britain, slavery in Zanzibar was officially abolished. At that time, Zanzibar had been one of the major centers of the East African slave trade. For decades, thousands of people had been bought and sold through the island's markets. The British Empire used its new control to shut down much of this trade. So despite the destruction and deaths, the war also accelerated major historical changes in the region. But historians still debate an important question today. Was this really a war? Some experts argue that calling it a war is almost absurd, because Zanzibar never truly had a chance to fight back. The technological gap between the two sides was enormous. Britain possessed modern steel warships, trained military forces, and powerful artillery. Zanzibar had outdated weapons, wooden defenses, and almost no modern military infrastructure. The outcome was decided before the first shot was fired. And yet, officially, it remains the shortest war in human history. Even today, more than a century later, the 38-minute war continues to fascinate historians around the world, because it perfectly symbolizes the era of colonial empires, an era when powerful nations could destroy smaller states in less than an hour. And perhaps the most disturbing detail of all, some reports say that many civilians in Zanzibar did not even realize a war had started until it was already over. Imagine hearing explosions somewhere in the city, seeing smoke above the rooftops, and then discovering that an entire war had already begun and ended before breakfast. That is how fast it happened. 38 minutes. Shorter than a football match. Shorter than most YouTube videos. Shorter than a normal school lesson. And yet, those 38 minutes changed the history of Zanzibar forever. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories ahead about the darkest, strangest, and most shocking events in human history. And remember, sometimes history is changed not by years of war, but by just 38 minutes.